Mother, you bonded with him last night. When is it my turn? Ethan Cade's boots sank into the soft, ochre-colored dust of Zehl'varis's desert plain, each step stirring a small cloud that rose around his ankles. The world beyond him shimmered, rippling with a heat that reminded him of half-forgotten summers on Earth. He stopped for a moment, letting his gaze drift over the vast horizon where rolling dunes gave way to ridges of obsidian-like rock. In the distance, crystalline formations jutted upward in ragged spires, each reflecting a fractured prism of the sinking sun. These formations had spread alarmingly in recent weeks, turning once fertile land into brittle fields of lethal shards. He felt the handle of his knife beneath his fingertips, the pads of his fingers tracing it in that old, anxious habit he couldn't quite break. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin deeply tanned from too many days under unfamiliar suns. His dark brown hair was thick and wavy, brushing the tops of his shoulders. He kept it tied back in a loose knot whenever he could, but the wind here was relentless, tugging free a few strands. A short beard shadowed his jaw, its rough edges catching the light with flecks of grey. His hazel eyes, flecked with gold, scanned the horizon with practiced caution. He was no stranger to danger. The scars that crossed his forearms and the slight hitch in his left knee told of battles lost and won on other planets. Yet here on Zehl'varis, he felt a particular heaviness. This place had become his home, at least for now. He had responsibilities, supplies to procure, and people who depended on him, or so he told himself. In truth, he was a man trying to outrun a grief that still cut him to the core. His mind flickered to the memory of his younger brother, lost in a catastrophic evacuation when they'd first come to the frontier. A single miscalculation had doomed the vessel carrying him. Ethan had been the one in charge of the safety checks. That guilt had eaten away at him ever since. Protecting others, ensuring that no one else under his watch died, had become his mission. It was easier to stay on the move, volunteering for the most dangerous scouting trips. Better to keep others at a distance than to let them see the fractured man behind the stoic mask. He glanced over his shoulder and spotted two figures picking their way carefully through the shifting sand. They were both from the Tharai clan, the native people of Zehl'varis, and even though he had worked with them for months, he still found them mesmerizing. Their silhouettes were tall and lean, their hair fluttering in the arid breeze. At first glance, one might think they were related only by the subtle taper of their ears, but in truth, they were mother and daughter, Aenya Tharei and her child Riala. Aenya walked with a kind of poised grace, her limbs strong yet fluid. Her skin, an olive hue touched with a faint radiance, caught the fading sunlight as if reflecting it from beneath the surface. Her long black hair, streaked with hints of deep indigo, spilled down her back. In the glow of the afternoon, the lines across her temples pulsed gently, a phenomenon Ethan had learned to read. Those lines seemed more vivid when she was tense or excited, and right now they looked as if they thrummed with cautious energy. She wore simple, utilitarian attire suitable for desert travel, light fabrics that draped around her body, exposing arms marked by faint scars of her own. Small metallic loops adorned the pointed tips of her ears, catching glints of orange light with each step. He couldn't hear it at this distance, but he knew that if she were feeling anxious or uncertain, a soft humming might be rising from her throat, a harmonic note that was a byproduct of her species' biology and culture. It was an endearing quirk, something that had first startled him, but soon became a comforting presence. Beside her, Riala Tharei moved with quicker steps, her form more slender than her mother's, but her youthful energy was evident in each stride. Her skin had a paler greenish tint, reminiscent of weathered sea glass. Black hair, streaked with metallic silver, framed a face that was sharper, more angular than Anya's. At her collarbone, swirling patterns like etched jade curled and looped in delicate designs. She wore more playful adornments on her ears, tiny dangling beads that chimed faintly whenever she tossed her head or turned too quickly. There was a spark in her emerald and teal shifting eyes, a vibrancy that made Ethan think she was as eager to prove herself as any young explorer he'd known. He caught her glancing at him now and then, her fingers tapping together in that quick, rhythmic pattern that signaled her curiosity or excitement. He'd come to realize it was part of her people's courting gestures, though she used it in all sorts of contexts. The three of them had set out earlier that day to scout a new region where the crystalline spread had intensified. If they could map the edges of the growth, they might find a way to protect the human outpost and the Tharai settlement that had grown more interconnected over the past few seasons. Supplies were scarce. The planetary ecosystem was changing, and the power core that supplied the settlement's shield dome was malfunctioning. Without a stable energy source, everyone would be vulnerable to the creeping crystals, not to mention the possibility of further environmental collapse. He stopped, raising a hand to signal a halt. Aenya and Riala slowed their approach, eyes flicking around for threats. In the stillness, the desert's hush pressed upon them, broken only by the whisper of wind. Then came a faint, resonant hum from somewhere ahead. Ethan recognized that sound. He'd heard it before, the eerie melody of the crystalline growth. "We're close," he said, keeping his voice low. Anya's markings brightened subtly, and she nodded, stepping up beside him. Her gaze moved over the landscape. "They spread faster in these regions," she said softly. Her voice was melodic, even when subdued. "We must be careful not to disturb them." Riala came up on his other side, her face reflecting an eagerness to see what lay ahead. She tapped her fingers lightly, a quick staccato beat, then forced her hands to her sides. "We'll be fine," she said. "We have Ethan." She spoke his name with an almost playful lilt. She was young, but not so young that she didn't notice the way her mother and he sometimes exchanged glances or lingered near each other after a mission. She admired him, though Ethan could sense a tinge of tension whenever she looked at Aenya. He was still uncertain how to navigate the dynamic between them. He didn't know all the intricacies of the Tharai bonding rituals, but he was aware that a bond was considered sacred, some mixture of emotional and physical closeness that transcended simple relationships. He'd been here long enough to see how couples connected, the subtle interplay of body and mind. When Aenya looked at him, he felt a pull, an ache that both enticed and terrified him. He'd been drawn to her from the first moment he'd seen her hold a child's hand, comforting a frightened youngster during a sandstorm. There was a deep, maternal tenderness to her, coupled with the fierceness of a warrior. He'd also felt the subtle shift in Riala's behavior toward him, especially in the past weeks, though she was far younger and still exploring her own identity. He sensed her fascination, but it was complicated by the obvious tension that flared whenever her mother was near him. They walked together over a dune, descending into a shallow valley of cracked earth and half-buried shards. The crystals here were taller than a man, their surfaces catching the last of the daylight in brilliant flashes of red and orange. Aenya pressed a hand to Ethan's shoulder, silently warning him of the unstable ground ahead. He nodded and crouched low, testing each step, mindful that beneath the cracked surface, the desert could give way. He moved with the confidence of someone who had navigated deadly terrain before. Riala followed suit, though her impatience sometimes made her steps heavier than they should have been. Ethan's fingers brushed his knife handle, that old habit flaring. He glanced back at them. "Step exactly where I step," he said softly. Anya's expression was calm, but her eyes carried an intensity that told him she was fully aware of the risk. Riala's lips pressed together, a flicker of defiance on her face, but she nodded. She was determined to prove she could be as cautious and capable as her mother. She matched Ethan's stride carefully, placing her feet in the prints he left behind. The hum of the crystals grew louder as they neared a ring of jagged spires. Each spire was the width of a small tree trunk, rising in a cluster that resembled a petrified grove. Ethan knew that inside these spires, the alien mineral spread like a living fungus, draining nutrients from the soil and releasing toxic residues that stunted plant life. If it wasn't stopped, it could overtake entire regions, leaving them barren. He also knew that this place, once mapped, could hold clues to how the spread was accelerating. The plan was to take readings, gather samples, and report back. They made their way into the cluster, carefully weaving between the sharp edges. Aenya knelt near a large shard, touching its surface. Her fingertips glided over the ridges, and she closed her eyes, her markings flickering faintly. "It's still growing," she said after a moment. "I can sense the vibrations. It's like it's feeding." Riala approached another spire, her face a mix of curiosity and concern. She reached out to touch it, but Ethan placed a hand on her wrist, gently pulling her back. "We don't know how stable these are," he cautioned. "One wrong touch could send shards flying." She nodded, swallowing her impatience. "I just want to understand them," she said, her voice quieter now. "If we knew how they spread, maybe we could stop them." Ethan admired her determination. He released her wrist but kept close, in case the ground shifted. Aenya rose from her inspection and turned to him, her dark eyes reflecting the spire's shimmering light. "We'll take the samples from the outer edges," she said. "Then we should leave before nightfall. The temperature drop here can be extreme." Ethan agreed. Night on Zehl'varis brought a bitter cold that could sap the warmth from a body within hours. As they moved along the perimeter, collecting small slivers of crystal in reinforced containers, he couldn't help but notice how Anya's presence steadied him. Her calm confidence guided his own movements, reminding him to breathe, to be in the moment. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. They were almost finished when a low rumble rippled through the ground. Ethan's head shot up. Anya's markings flared with alarm, and Riala stumbled. The spire near her gave a sharp crack, as if something inside it was splitting. "Get back!" Ethan shouted, lunging forward. The spire fractured at its base, leaning precariously toward Riala. She froze for a split second, eyes wide. He covered the distance in 2 long strides, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her away just as the crystal crashed to the ground. Shards scattered, some slicing into the air with a deadly whistle. He turned his back to the flying debris, shielding her with his body. Pain tore through his shoulder as a fragment sliced through his jacket. Aenya rushed over, eyes bright with fear. When the shards settled, Ethan let out a ragged breath, releasing Riala. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of shock and gratitude. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I misjudged the stability." Her fingers tapped together in a frantic pattern before she clenched her hands into fists, trying to still them. Ethan winced, feeling warm blood trickle down his shoulder. "It's okay," he said, his voice tight. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, blinking back tears. "No, I'm fine. Your shoulder." Anya's hands were already there, examining the wound with gentle precision. "We need to clean this," she said. "But first we get out of here. That might have destabilized more of them." Indeed, the hum in the crystals had grown louder, like an ominous chorus vibrating through the desert floor. Ethan's heart pounded, but he nodded. They hurried away from the spires, keeping a safe distance as they made their way back across the dune. When they finally crested the rise, Ethan sank to his knees, letting Aenya tend to the wound. She tore a strip of cloth from her garment, pressing it to his shoulder to stanch the bleeding. Riala hovered beside them, her face etched with worry. He forced a grin, trying to reassure her. "Don't blame yourself," he said. "I've had worse." Aenya shot him a glance that was equal parts concern and admonishment. "We'll patch you up properly at camp," she said. Her voice was gentle but firm, and her markings had settled back into a calmer rhythm. They continued on, though their pace was slower now, mindful of Ethan's injury. By the time they reached the temporary camp, a small outpost near the edge of a rocky plateau, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air was turning cold. The outpost was little more than a few shelters and supply crates, a place for scouts to rest before returning to the main settlement. Aenya helped Ethan into one of the shelters, where a single lantern cast a soft glow across the interior. Riala hovered by the entrance, unsure whether to enter. Aenya shot her a look, and she stepped aside, giving them space. Ethan sat on a makeshift cot, peeling off his jacket. The gash in his shoulder was not deep, but it was bleeding steadily. Aenya poured water into a basin and gently washed the wound. He winced at the sting, but found himself watching her face, the subtle concentration in her eyes, the slight crease of her brow. She hummed softly, almost as if trying to soothe both him and herself. When she spoke, her voice was hushed, intimate. "You're always risking yourself for us, for my daughter." Her gaze flicked up to meet his. "I don't know how to repay that." He swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. "No debt," he said. I just don't want anyone else to die on my watch." The words hung in the air, hinting at a deeper pain. He saw the understanding in her eyes. They had shared fragments of their pasts, enough to know each other's scars ran deeper than the skin. She pressed a clean cloth to his shoulder, applying a healing salve her people used. The pain eased slightly, replaced by a dull ache. "Thank you," he murmured. He realized how close she was, the warmth of her body radiating through the thin air. The faint shimmer in her skin reminded him of the first time he'd noticed it, a subtle glow that seemed alive with her heartbeat. She nodded, not pulling away. "You've given Riala someone to look up to," she said. "She admires your bravery." There was a hint of something else in her voice, a flicker of concern. "But she's young, and our customs. Bonding is not something she fully understands yet. I see how she looks at you." Ethan exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "I've noticed," he admitted. "I don't want to confuse her, or you." Aenya reached out, her fingers grazing his uninjured shoulder. "I know. She yearns for a bond, to feel the closeness that our people cherish. She lost her father when she was young, and I think part of her sees you as the kind of presence she's been missing. But there's also an attraction, a curiosity about what a bond with a human might be like." He felt his pulse quicken at her words. He wanted to say something, to assure her he would never take advantage of Riala's youth or confusion. But before he could form the words, she leaned in, pressing her forehead to his gently. It was a gesture of comfort and connection he had come to recognize. He closed his eyes, letting the tension ease from his shoulders as he breathed in her scent, something like sage and distant rain. They stayed like that for a moment, the only sound the soft flicker of the lantern. Then Aenya pulled back, her eyes reflecting a tender resolve. "Rest," she said, her voice low. "We'll talk more when you've healed." He nodded, 1,000 unspoken thoughts swirling in his mind. She stepped away, leaving the shelter. Outside, Riala was likely pacing, waiting for news of his condition. He heard their voices, hushed but earnest, and he wondered what words passed between them. There was a knot of unease in his stomach, not just from the wound, but from the growing awareness of the complicated bond forming among the three of them. As the night wore on, the temperature plummeted. He pulled a thin blanket around himself, listening to the wind rattle the walls of the shelter. Sleep was elusive. Memories of his brother's final moments drifted in, unbidden. He remembered the static-laden transmission, the panic in his brother's voice as the evacuation shuttle malfunctioned. Ethan had been powerless to help, and the guilt of that failure still clung to him. It was why he threw himself into protecting others now. He had to believe he could atone for that loss somehow. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. In the morning, he awoke to find his shoulder stiff, but the bleeding stopped. The salve Aenya had used was remarkably effective, a testament to Tharai healing traditions. He emerged from the shelter to find the desert painted in the soft purples and pinks of dawn. Riala was sitting by a small fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up at him, her eyes flickering between relief and something like embarrassment. "You're awake," she said, her voice quiet. He nodded. "Thanks to your mother's care." He sat beside her, wincing slightly as he moved his arm. "How are you?" She shrugged, her fingers tapping briefly before she clasped her hands. "I'm all right, just thinking." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press her. After a moment she spoke again. "I want to be stronger. I made a mistake yesterday. I almost got myself killed. And you got hurt saving me." She dropped her gaze, her cheeks flushing a soft greenish tint. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "I've been doing this a long time," he said gently. "Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is, you learn from them." She nodded, her eyes lingering on his hand. There was a yearning there, a vulnerability that reminded him how young she really was. He felt a pang of protectiveness, the same protectiveness that had driven him to shield her from the falling spire. He withdrew his hand carefully, not wanting to give the wrong impression. Aenya approached from the far side of the camp, carrying a small bundle of supplies. Her gaze flicked between them, and she offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. "We should eat, then head back to the settlement," she said. "We have the samples. We'll need to analyze them with the others." Riala stood, brushing dust from her clothing. "I'll get the water," she said, hurrying off toward a storage crate. Ethan watched her go, then turned to Aenya. "She's taking it hard," he murmured. Aenya sighed, a softness in her dark eyes. "She wants to prove herself. It's been hard for her to grow up without a father. Our people place great emphasis on the bond between mates, and she feels the absence keenly." She paused, then added, "And she sees my connection with you. It stirs something in her, both longing and envy." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I understand. I just don't want to cause any rift between you two." She reached out and brushed her fingers against his cheek, a tender gesture that made his heart skip. "We will navigate this," she said, "but be patient with her, and with yourself." They shared a quiet meal, the tension lingering like a subtle undercurrent. Once they finished, they packed their findings and broke down the camp. The journey back to the settlement was uneventful, save for a moment when they had to detour around another field of smaller crystal growths. Riala stayed close to Ethan, occasionally asking questions about how he scouted the safest paths. He explained his process, trying to encourage her curiosity while emphasizing caution. She seemed grateful for the guidance, though her eyes lingered on him in a way that made him feel both protective and uneasy. By midday, they reached the outskirts of the settlement, a cluster of domed structures and tents near the base of a towering rock formation. The settlement had begun as a human outpost, but over time, Tharai dwellings had sprung up alongside it. Now, it was a tapestry of two cultures interwoven, though tensions still existed. The crystals that threatened the land also threatened their fragile peace. Resources were scarce, and the power core that generated the settlement's protective shield was failing. They entered a central hub where scientists and engineers, both human and Tharai, were studying the crystals and trying to stabilize the power core. Aenya and Riala handed over the samples, explaining where they were collected. The researchers listened intently, exchanging worried looks when they heard how quickly the spires were growing. One of the engineers, a wiry man named Lang, pulled Ethan aside. "We're running out of time," he said, lowering his voice. "The shield's power core is failing, and the backup is barely functional. If we can't fix it soon, we won't be able to protect the settlement from the crystals, let alone from other environmental hazards." Ethan nodded grimly. "We'll do whatever we can. The Tharai might have more knowledge of the crystal's properties. Maybe we can disrupt its growth or redirect it." Lang ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Work with Aenya and the others. We need a plan, fast." Aenya joined them, her expression serious. "Our elders have some knowledge, but they also have their own agenda. Some believe humans are part of the problem, that our presence here accelerates the crystal spread." Her lips pressed together. "We need proof that we can coexist, that we can save this land together. Otherwise, they might push for more drastic measures." Ethan recalled rumors that certain Tharai factions had sabotaged human equipment in the past, hoping to drive them away. He glanced at Aenya, wondering if she suspected the same might be happening now. "We'll figure it out," he said, trying to sound confident, "but we'll need help from all sides." They spent the rest of the day in tense discussions, analyzing the crystal samples and the data from the field. Riala hovered nearby, listening, occasionally offering a shy comment. She was bright, and Ethan could see she had a knack for observation. Aenya encouraged her to speak, but Riala seemed hesitant, as though worried about stepping on her mother's authority. As dusk approached, the settlement lit up with scattered lanterns and energy orbs powered by the failing core. Aenya led Ethan to a quieter corner of the settlement, near a small garden where alien plants rustled softly in the evening breeze. Their leaves shimmered with a faint metallic sheen, curling inward at the drop in temperature. He could smell the rich, earthy scent of the soil, a reminder that life here still clung to hope. She sat on a low bench, and he joined her. For a moment, they simply breathed in the quiet. Then she spoke. "Ethan, I need to ask you something." Her tone was gentle but resolute. "We share a bond that's growing. You felt it too." He felt his heartbeat quicken. He had known it was there, a slow burn of attraction that had deepened into something more, but he had also been afraid to put it into words. "Yes," he said softly. "I feel it, but I also know it complicates things, especially with Riala." Anya's gaze flickered. "She is young, but in our culture, youth does not always mean innocence. She's reached the age where she can choose to seek a bond. She's fixated on you, partly because she sees how you protect us, how you saved me once before." She paused, swallowing. "I can't ignore her feelings, nor can I ignore mine." Ethan pressed his lips together. He had never been in a situation quite like this, where a mother and daughter both harbored such strong emotions toward him. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Aenya reached for his hand, her touch warm against the chill of the evening. "I want you to be honest. With me, with her, and with yourself. If we choose to bond, it has to be with open hearts. My people's tradition allows multiple bonds, but it is always guided by mutual respect and understanding. Riala is still learning what that means." He closed his eyes, memories of his brother's death surfacing once more. He remembered how he had vowed never to let himself become too entangled in others' lives, to avoid the pain of losing someone again. Yet here he was, drawn into a connection that challenged his defenses. "I don't want to hurt either of you," he said quietly. She squeezed his hand. "Then don't, but also don't deny your heart out of fear." They fell into a companionable silence, the hum of distant machinery blending with the rustle of alien foliage. In that moment, Ethan realized just how deeply he cared for Aenya. She was strong, wise, and compassionate, qualities he admired and desired. At the same time, he felt protective of Riala, wanting to guide her, to help her find her own path. But the idea of her wanting a bond with him made him uneasy, both because of her youth and because he sensed her feelings were intertwined with the need for a father figure she never had. Night settled in fully, and the stars emerged, glittering in unfamiliar constellations. Aenya stood, pulling him gently to his feet. "Come," she said softly. "Let's share warmth. It's cold tonight." He followed her to her dwelling, a small domed structure with a single interior room. Riala was not there. Perhaps she was still out or staying elsewhere. Aenya closed the door behind them, and the lantern light revealed the modest furnishings, a low table, woven mats on the floor, a sleeping area lined with soft textiles. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of vulnerability and longing. He hesitated, heart pounding, as she stepped closer. "I know you fear losing another person," she said gently. "But if we never allow ourselves to connect, we lose something far greater." She reached for his injured shoulder, tracing the bandage with light fingertips. He felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. Slowly, She guided him to the sleeping mat. They knelt there, face to face, the lantern casting shifting shadows on the walls. He watched as the faint shimmer beneath her skin grew more pronounced, a subtle dance of light that seemed to respond to her rising emotions. His breath caught when she leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a soft, tentative kiss. He closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. Her mouth was warm, and he could taste a hint of the herbal tea they had shared earlier. Her hand slid up to cup his face, and he felt a tremor run through his body. He deepened the kiss, letting go of the tight coil of fear inside him. For a moment he was simply present, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. Her markings pulsed, the lines along her temples glowing with a soft, rhythmic pulse that matched the racing of her heart. He ran a hand through her hair, marveling at the silky strands that carried faint whispers of indigo. She responded with a quiet moan, and he sensed a kind of gentle hum resonating from her chest, an instinctive expression of pleasure and connection. They sank onto the mat, hands roaming over each other's bodies, exploring, learning. His shirt was discarded, revealing the scars on his torso, each one telling a story of survival. She traced them with reverent fingers, as if acknowledging the battles he had fought. He tugged at the ties of her garment, revealing the smooth planes of her abdomen and the subtle glow of her skin. She shivered beneath his touch, her breath catching in her throat. They moved closer, limbs entwined, sharing warmth and whispered confessions in the low light. The air seemed charged with an electric tension that built with each touch. Aenya's lips traveled along his jaw, down his neck, leaving a trail of soft kisses. He let out a ragged breath, overwhelmed by the intensity of sensation. Her body pressed against his, and he felt the softness of her skin against his scars, a reminder that they were both flawed and vulnerable. Their shared breath mingled, carrying hints of longing and unspoken fears. As their desire peaked, they surrendered to the moment, bodies moving in a slow, sensuous dance that spoke of mutual need and respect. The tension between them finally found release in a series of tender, passionate waves. Aenya's markings flared, brightening in a display of intimate surrender that Ethan found breathtaking. He held her as she trembled, her hum resonating against his chest, echoing in his very bones. When the heat of that moment finally eased, they lay entwined, hearts thudding in unison. The lantern light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the curved walls. Aenya rested her head on his chest, her hair fanning out around them. He stroked her back, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly connected to someone, as though the walls he had built were crumbling. He pressed a kiss to her temple, and she sighed contentedly. In the hush that followed, he could almost forget the looming crisis of the crystals, the failing power core, and the complicated dynamic with Riala. But reality waited outside, as harsh and unyielding as the desert sun. Still, for this brief time he allowed himself to sink into the warmth of Enya's embrace, inhaling the subtle fragrance of her skin. They must have dozed off, because he woke to a faint scraping sound at the door. He tensed, old instincts kicking in. Aenya stirred, sitting up with a drowsy blink. The door slid open a crack, and Riala's voice floated through. "Mother?" She sounded hesitant, as if she feared intruding. Aenya rose, pulling a light covering around her body. Ethan quickly found his discarded clothes and slipped them on, heat creeping up his neck at the thought of Riala finding them like this. Aenya opened the door, and Riala stepped inside, her eyes flicking between her mother's disheveled state and Ethan's presence. Her cheeks flushed a deeper green, and her fingers started tapping together in that telltale pattern. "You bonded with him last night," she said, her voice trembling. "When is it my turn?" Ethan felt his stomach drop. He looked at Aenya, whose expression flickered with surprise and concern. Riala stood there, a storm of emotion in her eyes. Hurt, envy, curiosity, and an unmistakable yearning. She stepped closer, looking up at Ethan with a mix of defiance and desperation. "I'm not a child anymore," she said, her voice tight. "You both treat me like I'm too young to understand. But I do. I want a bond too. I want to feel what you two share." Aenya sighed, stepping forward to place a hand on Riala's arm. "My daughter, this is not something to rush," she said gently. "A bond is sacred. It must be chosen freely by all involved. And you are still learning about yourself." Riala jerked her arm away, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know what I want," she insisted. She turned to Ethan, her gaze pleading. "You saved me. You make me feel safe. Why can't you see me as someone worthy of your bond?" Ethan's throat constricted. He struggled for words. "Riala, I do care for you, but—" She cut him off, her voice trembling. "But I'm too young, right? Or is it that you don't want me because you have my mother?" Anya's markings flared with tension, and she moved to stand between them, a protective stance. "Enough," she said softly but firmly. "This conversation is too charged. We need to talk it through calmly." Riala's eyes darted from her mother to Ethan. Then she turned and fled, the door sliding shut behind her. Aenya let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging. Ethan felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had known Riala's feelings were complicated, but seeing them erupt like this was painful. Aenya turned to him, her expression torn. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have anticipated this reaction." He shook his head. "No, I knew she felt something. I just didn't think she would confront us like this." She sank onto the edge of the sleeping mat, burying her face in her hands. "She lost her father so young. She's been searching for something, someone to fill that void. She admires you, but she also yearns for a bond of her own. Our culture's traditions can be confusing, especially for someone her age." He joined her, resting a hand on her back. "What do we do?" She lifted her head, a sadness in her eyes. "We talk to her. We make her understand that a bond must come from mutual respect and readiness. She cannot demand it. And you, if you are willing, you can help guide her, show her how to be strong without rushing into something that will only hurt her." He nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. He wasn't sure he was the right person to guide Riala. He was still haunted by his own ghosts, his own fears of losing those he cared about. Yet he couldn't deny he felt a responsibility to help her. And if Aenya wanted him to be part of their lives, he would have to find a way to navigate this delicate situation. They dressed in silence, then stepped out into the settlement's morning bustle. The day was bright, and the air carried the faint tang of metal and dust. They split up to look for Riala, eventually finding her near the settlement's boundary, where the shield's perimeter shimmered faintly. She stood by a section of equipment, fiddling with a small console that monitored the shield's energy output. Her shoulders were tense, and she didn't turn when they approached. Aenya spoke first, her voice soft. "Riala, please, we need to talk." Riala kept her eyes on the console, but her voice trembled with anger and hurt. "You already did enough talking last night." Ethan stepped forward carefully. "We don't want to dismiss your feelings," he said, "but bonding is serious. It's not something that can happen out of anger or jealousy." She whirled around, tears in her eyes. "I'm not just a child. I know what I feel." She glanced at the console, then back at them. "You both think I'm reckless. Maybe I am. But I'm tired of being protected, treated like I'll break. I want to help. I want to stand beside you, not behind you." Aenya reached out, gently turning Riala to face her. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You want to prove yourself, but there are better ways than demanding a bond you may not be ready for." Riala's gaze flicked to Ethan, and he saw the raw longing there. "Will you at least promise to see me as more than just a child? To let me prove I can be part of this, part of what you and my mother are building?" He swallowed, choosing his words carefully. "I promise to respect you and acknowledge your strengths," he said. "And I promise to be honest with you. That includes telling you that I think you need time to figure out what you truly want." Her eyes dropped, and she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Aenya pulled her into an embrace, and after a moment, Riala returned it. Ethan watched, relief and uncertainty mingling in his chest. This was far from resolved, but at least they were talking. They spent the following days pouring themselves into the settlement's crisis. The power core was nearing a critical failure, and the crystal spread was accelerating. Rumors circulated that some Tharai elders were withholding knowledge of the crystal's weaknesses, hoping to leverage the situation to push humans off the planet. Others insisted humans were the best hope of finding a technological solution. The tension was palpable. Aenya, Riala and Ethan worked together, combining their respective skills. Aenya possessed an intimate understanding of the planet's subtle vibrations, able to sense shifts in the crystal fields. Riala proved adept at analyzing data, surprising everyone with her quick grasp of the technology that monitored the shield's resonance. Ethan's expertise in tactical planning and survival was crucial for scouting safe paths and orchestrating salvage missions to retrieve spare parts. One afternoon, they embarked on a mission to recover an old energy module rumored to be stored in a derelict human facility on the far side of the settlement. The facility lay beyond a region heavily infested with crystalline growths. If they could retrieve the module, they might be able to stabilize the failing core. Aenya, Riala and Ethan led a small team, weaving through the desert under a sky streaked with violet clouds. The heat was oppressive, and the crystals loomed like silent sentinels. As they neared the abandoned structure, an old research station half buried in sand, they found the entrance blocked by a collapsed roof. Riala pointed out a narrow fissure in the structure's side, just large enough for them to squeeze through. Ethan tested it, making sure it wouldn't cave in further. Then they slipped inside, the interior lit only by the beams of their portable lanterns. The corridors were cramped and littered with debris. Broken crates, overturned tables, and scattered equipment told the story of a hasty evacuation long ago. The walls hummed faintly with the encroaching crystals, which had begun to infiltrate the facility. Their presence was a constant reminder of the ticking clock. They split up into pairs to search for the energy module. Aenya went with Riala, while Ethan took another scout. The air was stale, and dust motes swirled in their lantern light. Every so often, a distant crack signaled another part of the structure giving way. Time was short. Ethan and his companion found a sealed storage room. With some effort, they forced the door open, revealing shelves of rusted canisters and electronic components. They searched quickly, but the module was not there. Meanwhile, Aenya and Riala ventured deeper into the facility. Riala's curiosity drove her to check every console, scanning for any mention of the module's location. Aenya kept a hand on the walls, her markings flickering as she tuned into the structure's vibrations, trying to sense any impending collapse. After a tense half-hour, Riala let out a triumphant cry. She had found a log indicating the module was stored in a subterranean chamber accessible by a ladder shaft. They regrouped at the shaft, peering down into darkness. The ladder was corroded, and a portion had broken off. Aenya tested it gingerly, and it groaned under her weight. "It might hold one person at a time," she said, glancing at Ethan. He nodded. "I'll go first. If it gives out, I'll try to catch myself on the ledges." He began descending, wincing at each squeak of metal. About 15 feet down, he reached a ledge. The corridor below was partially collapsed, but passable. He called up, "It's safe enough. Send down the rope for the supplies." Aenya followed, her lithe form making the climb easier. She passed the supplies down to him, then helped Riala onto the ladder. Riala's face was set in determination, her jaw tight. She made her way carefully, rung by rung. Near the bottom, one of the rungs snapped. She let out a startled yelp, but Enya's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Riala dangled for a heart-stopping second before Ethan braced himself below, arms outstretched. Aenya lowered her gently, and she landed in Ethan's arms, breathless. She stared up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He set her down, heart hammering. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Thanks," she murmured. Aenya patted her shoulder, relief evident in her expression. They pressed on, navigating the collapsed corridor until they reached the chamber that held the module. The door was locked, but Riala managed to hack the ancient control panel with surprising skill. Inside, they found the energy module, a cylindrical device covered in dust and half hidden by debris. They carefully lifted it onto a cart they had brought, checking its condition. Though old, it appeared intact. But as they prepared to leave, a tremor shook the chamber. Bits of the ceiling rained down. Enya's eyes widened. "The crystals above us must have shifted," she said. "We have to get out now." They hurried back toward the shaft, pushing the cart. Another quake rippled through the structure. The corridor walls groaned, cracks spidering across them. They reached the shaft to find a nightmare scene. The ladder had collapsed entirely and debris blocked most of the opening. A thin gap remained at the top, but there was no easy way to climb up. Ethan cursed under his breath, searching for another exit. Aenya placed her hands on the walls, closing her eyes. Her markings glowed as she tried to sense a path through the vibrations. Riala scanned her console, tapping furiously. "There's a maintenance tunnel on the east side," she said. "It might lead to the surface." They rushed in that direction, the floor shaking beneath them. The maintenance tunnel was a narrow passage with pipes running along the ceiling. Crystals had begun to invade here too, creeping in from cracks in the walls. The hum was louder, resonating in Ethan's chest like a living heartbeat. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. They pressed on, the energy module rattling on the cart. The tunnel turned sharply, and they found a metal hatch overhead. Riala tried the console, but it was dead. She looked to Ethan, desperation in her eyes. "It's sealed shut." He nodded, stepping forward to pry at the hatch with a crowbar. The metal groaned, refusing to budge. Another quake hit, and the ceiling behind them collapsed, blocking their retreat. They were running out of time. Aenya placed her hand on the hatch, her eyes narrowing. She began to hum in that deep, resonant way, the tone seeming to vibrate the air around them. Riala joined in, her higher voice creating a harmonic chord that Ethan could feel in his bones. He stared, awed by their synergy. The Tharai had a way of using sound and vibration to manipulate certain materials. He wasn't entirely sure how it worked, but he'd seen them do something similar on a smaller scale. Slowly, the hatch began to shake. The resonance built, loosening the rusted mechanism. Ethan seized the moment, wedging the crowbar in again and pulling with all his might. With a tortured squeal, the hatch gave way, swinging open. Light filtered in from above, pale and dusty, but it was hope. They quickly secured a rope, and Ethan climbed out first, emerging onto a rubble-strewn surface. He braced himself, helping pull up the energy module. Then he helped Aenya and Riala clamber out. Moments later, the tunnel behind them collapsed entirely, sending up a cloud of dust that stung their eyes. They coughed, leaning on each other for support. The facility had caved in, leaving them in a small clearing surrounded by twisted metal, but they had the module, and they were alive. Relief washed over them. Riala let out a shaky laugh, tears glistening on her cheeks. "We did it," she whispered. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, giving her a brief squeeze. "Yeah, we did," he said, his voice hoarse. Aenya stood on his other side, resting a hand on his back. The three of them shared a moment of triumph, a bond forged in danger and teamwork. They made their way back to the settlement, exhausted but victorious. The engineers rejoiced at the sight of the module, immediately setting to work on installing it in the power core. Aenya and Riala retreated to their dwelling to clean up and rest, while Ethan went to check in with Lang and the others. The plan was to integrate the module into the failing system, hoping it would stabilize the shield. If it worked, they would have more time to address the crystal spread. That evening, the settlement gathered to witness the power core's reactivation. Tense anticipation hung in the air as the engineers powered up the new module. Lights flickered and the shield shimmered, then steadied, forming a faint dome overhead. A collective cheer went up, relief evident in every face. But the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that the crystal threat remained. They had merely bought time. Ethan found Aenya and Riala standing on a balcony overlooking the settlement. The sky above them was awash of deep purples and blacks, studded with unfamiliar stars. He joined them, noticing the way Riala stood a little taller, her shoulders squared. She glanced at him, a soft smile on her lips. "We made a good team," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. He nodded, smiling back. "We did. You showed real bravery back there." Her cheeks warmed at the praise. Aenya slipped an arm around her daughter's waist, then reached out to take Ethan's hand. The three of them stood in a quiet moment of solidarity. He felt the warmth of Enya's hand, the lingering tension of Riala's presence, and the swirl of emotions in his own chest. Over the next few days, the settlement's mood lifted. With the shield stabilized, they could focus on slowing the crystal spread. Aenya and Ethan spent long hours consulting with the elders, trying to glean any knowledge that might help. Riala continued assisting the scientists, impressing them with her analytical mind. She seemed more focused now, channeling her energy into helping her people. One evening, as the air cooled and the settlement grew quiet, Riala found Ethan alone near the perimeter. He was checking the newly reinforced shield generators. She approached, her footsteps soft. "I wanted to talk," she said, her voice calm. He turned, meeting her gaze. There was a new maturity in her eyes. "Of course," he said, stepping away from the console. She folded her hands, tapping her fingers only once before stilling them. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began, taking a deep breath. "About my outburst, about my desire for a bond. I realize now that I was acting out of jealousy and fear. I saw what you and my mother share, and I wanted it for myself. But I also wanted a father figure, someone to protect me." He listened, heart heavy with empathy. "Riala, you're strong enough to protect yourself," he said gently. "I'm here to help, but you don't need me as a crutch." She nodded. "I know, and I see that now. It doesn't mean I don't still care for you, or that I don't feel something when I'm near you. But I understand that a bond has to be mutual and chosen freely. I can't force it." He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I respect your honesty," he said, "and I care about you too. I want to see you grow into the person you're meant to be." She smiled, a flicker of sadness and acceptance crossing her features. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not treating me like a child, and for saving me more than once." They stood there for a moment, the hum of the shield a gentle backdrop. He could see the faint reflection of the settlement lights in her eyes. She took a step back, drawing in a steadying breath. "We'll figure this out together," she said. "All of us." He nodded, and she left, heading back toward the main cluster of dwellings. He remained there a while longer, contemplating the shifting sands outside the shield. The desert was quiet, but he knew the crystals continued their slow advance, waiting for an opportunity to encroach. The next morning, a commotion woke the settlement at dawn. Cries rang out, and people rushed to the perimeter. A section of the shield was flickering, and through the translucent barrier they could see a massive wave of crystals erupting from beneath the sand. The growth seemed to be reacting to the shield's energy, pulsing with each flicker. Lang and the engineers scrambled to stabilize the system, but the wave of crystals pressed closer. Ethan, Aenya, and Riala joined the defensive line. Tharai warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with human guards, weapons trained on the crystalline tide. But weapons alone wouldn't stop it. The crystals were not a simple enemy that could be shot down. They were a living force, feeding on the planet's energies. Aenya moved among the defenders, instructing them on how to avoid triggering further growth. Riala hurried to the control center, analyzing the resonance patterns to see if they could create a counter-frequency. Ethan followed Aenya, feeling the ground quake beneath him. He glimpsed the elders arriving, their expressions grim. One elder, a stern-faced woman named Saliath, locked eyes with Aenya. "We warned you about bonding with humans," she hissed, her voice thick with contempt. "You bring them here, and now the crystals threaten our home." Enya's jaw tightened. "This isn't the humans' doing," she shot back. "The crystals react to imbalances in the planet's energy. We need to work together to find a solution." Saliath snorted, turning away. Ethan bristled, but Aenya squeezed his arm, silently urging him not to engage. Time was too precious for political arguments. They rushed to a vantage point where they could see the creeping wave. The crystals shimmered in the early sunlight, forming an almost beautiful yet deadly cascade. Riala's voice crackled over the comm. "We're detecting a resonant frequency within the crystals. If we can invert the frequency at the right amplitude, we might disrupt their growth." Enya's eyes lit up with hope. "That's it," she said. "We can use our bonding hum, amplified by your technology, to create a counter-frequency." Ethan nodded. "How do we do that?" She grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the central tower where the engineers had rigged up an array of sonic emitters. Along the way, they gathered Riala, who was inputting data on a handheld device. Her face was set in concentration, her earlier emotional turmoil replaced by determination. They reached the tower, which housed a makeshift sonic projector. Lang and a few Tharai technicians were adjusting the equipment. Aenya conferred with them, explaining how she and Riala could produce harmonic tones that might cancel out the crystal's growth vibrations. Ethan's role was to keep the area secure and ensure the equipment remained powered. The shield flickered again, reminding them how close they were to total failure. Aenya and Riala climbed a narrow set of stairs to the top of the tower, where the projector's main emitter was located. Ethan followed, his heart pounding. The crystals had almost reached the shield, and the barrier was sparking in places. If the shield fell, the settlement would be overrun. They positioned themselves at the emitter, the desert wind whipping at their hair and clothes. Aenya glanced at Riala, who nodded. They closed their eyes, inhaling deeply. Then Aenya began to hum, a deep, resonant note that seemed to vibrate in Ethan's chest. Riala joined in, her higher pitch weaving with her mother's in a haunting melody. The projector picked up their voices, amplifying them out across the settlement and beyond the shield. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The crystals continued their relentless advance. But then Ethan noticed a subtle quiver in the nearest formations. The hum grew in intensity, guided by Riala's adjustments to the control panel. Aenya and Riala poured their emotions into the harmony: fear, hope, love, desperation, melding into a single powerful resonance. Slowly the crystals began to hesitate, as though uncertain. Their shimmering surfaces flickered and a few spires even cracked, sending shards tumbling to the ground. The wave's advance slowed. A collective gasp rose from the defenders below. Encouraged, Aenya and Riala pushed harder, their voices straining, sweat beading on their brows. Ethan stood behind them, ensuring the equipment stayed powered, adjusting dials under Riala's direction. Finally, with a thunderous crack, the largest spire shattered, collapsing into a heap of glittering fragments. The shockwave rippled through the crystalline wave, halting its momentum. One by one, the spires fractured, losing their cohesion. The flickering in the shield subsided, stabilizing as the immediate threat receded. A stunned silence fell over the settlement. Then cheers erupted, a cacophony of relief and joy. Aenya and Riala staggered, drained from the effort. Ethan caught Riala as she swayed, and Aenya leaned on him for support. They had done it, at least for now. The wave had been pushed back, giving the settlement a fighting chance. In the aftermath, people crowded around, celebrating and offering thanks. Even some of the elders looked humbled, though Saliath maintained a stiff composure. The team of engineers immediately began planning how to replicate the resonance on a larger scale, hoping to stabilize the planet's energies long-term. Aenya, Riala, and Ethan retreated to a quiet corner, exhausted but triumphant. Riala sank to the ground, breathing heavily. Aenya knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her face. Ethan crouched next to them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. The tension between mother and daughter seemed to have dissolved in the wake of their shared victory. They spent the night in vigil, ensuring the crystals did not regroup. By dawn, it was clear the wave had subsided, though the threat was not entirely gone. The settlement, however, had survived its greatest test. Hope blossomed that they could find a lasting solution to the crystal plague. A few days later, in a small ceremony, the elders and the human leaders gathered to acknowledge the bond that had formed among Aenya, Riala, and Ethan. The settlement had come to respect their teamwork, seeing it as a symbol of cooperation between two species. Even Salayeth, though still wary, offered a curt nod of respect. That evening, Aenya led Ethan to the same quiet garden where they had spoken before. The alien plants rustled in a gentle breeze, their leaves reflecting the soft lantern light. Riala joined them, her expression serene. They stood in a circle, hands joined. Aenya spoke in a low voice, addressing both of them. "We have faced danger and fear together. We have shared our vulnerabilities, our strengths. I want us to stand as a family, in whatever form that takes." Riala's eyes shone. "I know I acted rashly before," she said, her voice steady. "But I've grown. I've learned what it means to truly bond. I respect your connection, Mother, and I cherish Ethan as a protector, a friend, and someone who has helped me see my own strength." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion. He looked from Riala's earnest face to Anya's gentle smile. He saw in them a reflection of what he had lost, family, and now, perhaps, he had found a new one. "I promise to protect you both," he said, voice trembling slightly. "But I also promise to let you protect yourselves. We're stronger together." They sealed this understanding with a silent, shared moment. Aenya kissed Ethan softly, and Riala leaned against them both, feeling the warmth of unity. It wasn't the same kind of bond Aenya and Ethan shared, but it was no less significant. Riala had found her own place, stepping out of her mother's shadow to stand as an equal in their fight for survival. The following weeks brought cautious optimism. The settlement used the sonic resonance method to keep the crystals spread at bay, slowly reclaiming land that had been lost. The power core, bolstered by the recovered module, stabilized enough to give them a chance to build a future. Tharai and humans worked side by side, forging a fragile peace that felt more genuine each day. Ethan spent his time repairing infrastructure, training new scouts, and assisting Aenya and Riala with further research. He felt his guilt over his brother's death ease, replaced by a sense of purpose. Enya's presence calmed him, her quiet strength a balm to his weary soul. Riala's bright spirit reminded him of life's possibilities, her curiosity lighting the path forward. One evening, after a long day of work, the three of them gathered on a ridge overlooking the desert. The sky was ablaze with the colors of Zehl'varis' sunset, rich oranges, purples and pinks blending into a tapestry of light. The crystals in the distance gleamed, but they no longer looked quite so menacing, tempered by the knowledge that they could be held in check. They sat together, Riala in the middle, Aenya on one side, Ethan on the other. Aenya reached for Ethan's hand, and he laced his fingers with hers. Riala rested her head on her mother's shoulder, letting out a contented sigh. A gentle breeze ruffled their hair, carrying the scent of distant blossoms that had begun to bloom again now that the crystals were retreating. Ethan gazed at Aenya, recalling the night they first truly bonded. He felt the echo of that connection thrumming between them still, a living thing that had only grown stronger. He glanced at Riala, remembering how she had once demanded to know when it would be her turn. Now he saw in her eyes a peaceful acceptance and a maturity that made him proud. She was forging her own path, guided by their love but not defined by it. Aenya spoke softly, her voice carrying the melody of hope. "We've come a long way," she said, We've faced danger, heartbreak, and uncertainty, but we've found something worth fighting for." Riala nodded, her gaze on the horizon. "And we'll keep fighting, together." Ethan squeezed Anya's hand, then reached over to gently touch Riala's shoulder. "I never thought I'd find a home out here," he admitted, his voice low. "But I have. You two, you're my family now." They watched as the sun dipped below the dunes, painting the sky with a final blaze of color. In the distance, the settlement lights began to glow, a testament to their resilience. The future remained uncertain in many ways, but one thing was clear: they would face whatever came next as one. Night fell, and they made their way back to the settlement, the stars guiding their path. Aenya and Ethan walked hand in hand, while Riala bounded ahead, pausing now and then to point out constellations. Laughter echoed through the cool air, mingling with the soft hum of the shield overhead. When they reached Anya's dwelling, the three of them shared a quiet meal, reflecting on the day's progress. Then Riala retired to her own space, leaving Aenya and Ethan alone. They sat by the lantern's glow, hands entwined, exchanging soft words and gentle kisses. The memory of their first intimate night flooded Ethan's mind, but it was overlaid now with a deeper bond forged through shared trials. They had chosen each other again and again through every crisis and conflict. Later, as they lay together, the hush of the settlement around them, Ethan felt a wave of contentment wash over him. He thought of his brother, the pain of that loss no longer as sharp. He had found a new life, one that honored the memory of those he had lost by embracing the living. He pressed a kiss to Anya's hair, inhaling the comforting scent of sage and earth. She stirred, murmuring his name, and he smiled in the darkness. In the morning, they awoke to another bright day, the settlement already stirring with activity. The crystals were still out there, but the knowledge of how to hold them back gave everyone renewed determination. Over breakfast, Riala chatted excitedly about her plans to help map new safe zones for agriculture. Aenya discussed the next steps in refining the sonic resonance. Ethan offered his scouting expertise, ready to accompany them wherever they needed to go. Before they set out, Riala paused, looking at Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything, for seeing me, for respecting me, and for saving me, both in the tunnel and from my own confusion." He reached out and ruffled her hair affectionately, earning a mock scowl. "You saved yourself," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "I just gave you a hand." She smiled back, stepping away to gather her gear. Aenya slipped her arm around Ethan's waist, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "She's growing up," she murmured, "and we're all growing, thanks to what we've faced." He nodded, heart full. Together, they headed into the day, ready to continue the work of rebuilding and protecting their shared home. As they walked side by side, he thought about how far they had come from that first precarious meeting in the desert. The path ahead would not be easy, but they had forged a bond that transcended fear and doubt. In that bond, they had found love, family, and hope for a future free from the shadows of the past. When they reached the edge of the settlement, they paused, taking in the wide expanse of Zehl'varis's desert. The crystals in the distance glimmered under the sunlight, no longer an unstoppable force, but a challenge they knew how to meet. Ethan felt Anya's hand in his, and Riala's presence beside them, and he smiled. They were not alone anymore. They had each other, and that was enough to face whatever trials lay ahead. Though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: the conflict that had once threatened to tear them apart was now resolved. They had found a way to live, to love, and to thrive in this strange and beautiful land. And as they took their first steps beyond the settlement's boundary, they did so with hearts unburdened by the past, ready to embrace whatever came next as a family, united by choice, by love, and by the promise of a life truly shared.